Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode at Amazic.com, where we talk to leaders and influencers about Kubernetes and cloud native and related topics. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazic, and if you're joining us for the first time, I want to encourage you to head over to Amazic.com and check out all of the amazing stuff that we already have there. We have a bunch of interviews, we have articles, job listings, event coverage, and a whole lot more. So if you follow Kubernetes, cloud native, any of that stuff, if it's interesting to you, go to amazic.com and catch up on all that's happening there. I'm joined today by someone from Weworks, which is a company that I work with. As a disclaimer, I consult with them on their content marketing. So I'm really excited to talk to someone from Weworks today. And he is, let me get his second name right. He's Leo Murillo.
There you go.
He's the principal partner solutions architect at Weworks. And he's also the former co-chair of the GitOps working group, which was started by the CNCF. Leo, it's great to have you on the show with us. I checked your LinkedIn and you have about 5 or more active positions right now. So I just listed the two interesting ones that I saw, but you can tell us a bit more about yourself. And if I've left anything out, you can fill in the blanks there.
Awesome. Thank you, Twain. It's great to be here. I really appreciate to be invited. I work with Weworks as principal partner solutions architect, which basically focuses around hyperscalers and supporting the use cases and challenges that the hyperscaler clients are having with adopting Kubernetes at scale. I was co-chair for the first year of the GitOps working group, which is a project that was a working group that was started by the CNCF to define the kind of community consensed version of what GitOps is all about, right? And it's basically trying to get away from what happened with DevOps, where it's this just catchphrase that all of a sudden everybody started using, and everybody had a kind of a different version of what it meant. It was a phenomenal experience. The working group continues to operate. I'm no longer a co-chair, but it continues to operate. And out of the working group, there was a project that was spawned called the Open GitOps project, which is kind of like the project that holds everything that the working group has produced that is to persist, right? The Open GitOps principles that we're actually going to talk about today, and other artifacts, blog entries, and kind of like a lot of patterns and cool stuff. Before that, I was CTO for a Colorado-based startup that built cloud-native solutions. And before that, I worked with a startup in San Francisco that built virtual reality. So I've been in the industry for quite some time, and I've seen the kind of like paradigm change of the data center to the cloud to hybrid, right? So I've worked with companies of all sizes as they confront those challenges, right, and look to deliver more value to their clients, to their users.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Leo. So we'd like to get into your work at Weworks and your work with the partners, the hyperscalers a bit more. But before that, I want to touch upon just the concept of GitOps versus DevOps. And you spoke about that a little while ago. If you could give us just a brief summary of the differences and the similarities between GitOps and DevOps, that would be a great starting point.
DevOps, so let me put it this way. GitOps is a paradigm, is a technology, is an operating model that helps organizations that are looking to adopt or accelerate their DevOps focus and their DevOps journey. They're not excluded of one another. They're very much interrelated, because DevOps, like usually when people think about DevOps, they just focus on, like CI/CD or automation, right? But DevOps is about many, many other things. It's about organizational change, it's about culture change within an organization, it's about continuous improvement. There's many, many aspects of DevOps that are not quite technical, right? They're more organizational, they're more practical. GitOps basically brings a specific operating model into the picture that allows organizations to do DevOps faster, to do DevOps better, right? If you look at the principles where you're looking at codifying everything and declarative configuration and an operating model that can be shared across stakeholders in an organization, that you can use for security, that you can use for operations and developers, right? You're talking to the very same objectives that DevOps is talking to, right? Eliminating silos, reducing handoffs, accelerating the delivery of value, right? If you look at all these DevOps objectives, you can see how GitOps as an operating model, as tooling and a kind of way to apply technology helps to achieve them, right? So to me, they're very tightly intertwined, and GitOps helps organizations do DevOps better, do DevOps faster and easier. Now, more importantly, right, in a world where Kubernetes is becoming kind of like the center stage for containerized workloads, right? Yeah, does that answer your question?
All right, so you put a lot of thought into communicating the idea of GitOps. So I wanted to ask you, if someone is to ask you, give me a concise explanation or definition of GitOps, how would you explain it to them in a simple way?
It's interesting because that's one of the GitOps working group was basically asked for something very similar to that, and that's how the 4 GitOps principles came about. Mm-hmm. I think the 4 GitOps principles, as delineated by the Open GitOps project, are a very clear way to communicate how GitOps should be done. Okay. But I guess your question is not how it should be done, rather what it is. And to me, it's an operating model mm-hmm. that is cloud native, that is DevOps focused, that is secure by definition, that is secure by default. There's a way to do deployment. There's a way to manage and operate the cloud native architecture.
Great. I find it interesting that you didn't mention even the word Git, because obviously that comes down to the operational part. Yeah, but as a segue from there, I wanted to transition to your work with the GitOps working group. And if you head over to the Open GitOps website, there's the 4 core principles of GitOps that you guys have finalized on. So I want to read that out here so I get it right. So the 4 principles state that GitOps is declarative, it's versioned and immutable, it's pulled automatically, and it's continuously reconciled. So really brief, concise words and phrases here. But you guys obviously spent a lot of time, debating and hashing out what these exact words and phrases should be. Could you tell us a bit more about that process and which was actually the most difficult one to nail down?
It's funny because it was like it was the first time that I participated in kind of like that sort of journey, right, where you're looking to get the community to agree onto something. The one that was most debated was continuously reconciled, and it was very debated because of the meaning of continuous, which was fascinating, right? Because there was all this discussion as to what does continuous really mean, right? Is continuous equivalent to constant? Is there a delay to continuity, right? So continuous and reconciled was one of the more complex to agree on. And matter of fact, if you look at the Open GitOps documentation, there is even a kind of like a appendix, it's not an appendix, kind of like a lexico, like a dictionary attached to the principles, where we are actually elaborating on what the meaning of continuous is within the context of our principles. Then the other was the kind of like second in line was the idea of pulled automatically, because you mentioned something interesting just now, right? Like how I did not mention Git. The principles are applicable to many technologies and many patterns and paradigms, right? So Git is not the only repository where you can hold the declarative configuration that is versioned and immutable, right? There are other places where you can store it. And there was a similar concern as to what does
All right, could you give us an example of what apart from Git?
Well, for example, if you look at like an S3 bucket in AWS, right? An S3 bucket can be configured for versioning. Uh, it can, and if you have versioning enabled, that means that if you push another object that is identically named, it's actually not replacing the former object, rather just creating a new version of it, right? So you can effectively use an S3 bucket to store versioned configuration and immutable configuration. And there was a different aspect to it as well. You could effectively misuse Git and not get version and immutable, right? If you're improperly using Git and you're using the wrong, like you're force pushing stuff, and you're changing the timeline, the history of your Git commits, which is technically possible, you would not be satisfying the principle of version and immutable storage, right? So and this is kind of like all the nuance that went into defining what these are all about, and going back to pulled automatically, that opened up the debate of, is GitOps pull only, or can you do push based GitOps, right? At what point, like if you look at, for example, a air gapped environment, right, where configuration or container images or anything else eventually needs to get to that air gapped environment. How are you gonna do you need to pull that in? Can you push those artifacts into the environment and then have the agents pull them? And this was all the debate. It took months of going back and forth to get there. But definitely, I think the declarative and version and immutable were pretty much agreed upon. And I think those are the ones that more likely resemble former or previous operating models, previous paradigms, right? Like declarative configuration, like there's declarative tooling out there that pre-existed the concept of GitOps. Version and immutable, like immutable artifacts, immutable infrastructure existed already. The third and fourth principle are where I think GitOps brings a unique perspective, and a lot of its value actually lives there, like continuously reconciled. It doesn't happen once. It's this continuous process of introspection and drift detection, right? There's a lot of value there.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Great to hear about all that happens behind the scenes. But, I guess at some point it must have probably been like a language and literature course, and probably people whipping out the dictionaries to look up the meaning of words and stuff.
It was fascinating. It was fascinating. It's funny because it also, like, if you think about community, right, and open source, I had never been exposed to it. I kind of like, if you think about the traditional enterprise world, right, there's always this kind of like eventual deal breaker person, right, that says, well, you know what, like team lead, boom, this is the way that it should be, like even after all debate. And there's this urgency to get stuff out there. But that was different in the context of community, because there's an urgency, but it's not an urgency to get there fast. It's an urgency to get there right. And that was fascinating, right? Like people were much more interested. It doesn't matter if it takes a year, but the point is we're all going to get it perfect. We're going to get it right. And that was fascinating. And also the fact that there has to be consensus. And that was very fascinating to me also, because consensus doesn't mean that everybody says the same thing, but it means that there's a majority-driven agreement that the boundaries of the concepts that you are coming up with are satisfactory to most, even if it takes a long time. So that was very interesting to be a part of.
Yeah, I find it quite interesting because, there are a lot of organizations that are still trying to do declarative, still trying to do things the version way. And then there's principles 3 and 4, which are totally new. So it's really fascinating. And so I wanted to segue a bit to talk about GitOps adoption, because there's obviously a lot of organizations who are thinking, it seems like we're just done with DevOps. We made it. We reached the heights with DevOps. And now there's this new concept called GitOps, and it seems like, there's something more that we need to do. And so for these kind of organizations, what do you see as some of the challenges when it comes to GitOps adoption? How are they dealing with this? What do you see when you look around?
Well, first to talk about adoption, I think there's a definite trend in rapid adoption. I think what we're seeing more and more organizations saying, hey, you know what, this actually does make a lot of sense, like this. And as they try it out, even if there's this initial, barrier to overcome, where they're like, all right, one new term, one new way of doing things, right? Like, is there any value to it? Once they actually start to explore it, that value becomes evident. And the organizations are more and more realizing how it actually will bring benefit to what they're already doing. This is a trend that is also kind of fueled by another trend, which is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is rapidly, if not already, has become the de facto orchestrator for containerized workloads. It's on every cloud provider. It's you can run it anywhere, and it's rapidly evolving. And the principles of Open GitOps and GitOps as an operating model is very much compatible with Kubernetes. Kubernetes has an API. It allows you to declare everything. It already has a concept of kind of like reconciliation loop that makes sure that you're always kind of like running your workloads as you expect. So you put GitOps on top of that, and you have something very, very powerful. Now, I think the bigger challenge that organizations are running into is precisely what you mentioned. They're already on a journey. I think if we were to look at kind of like startup type of scenario where it's this greenfield company that is building cloud native right off the bat, to just go for it and be way more at ease with adopting. But that's not the reality for anybody out there. You know what I'm saying? There's all sorts of non-cloud native applications. There's all sorts of technical debt. There's all sorts of ongoing change, right, that organizations are going through. Mm-hmm. So I think the more important thing is to frame it in a way and approach it in a way where there's this new change, this new thing that we are proposing, right, becomes something that reduces the burden, not something that increases the burden, right? Which can be done. And I think that's where companies like Weworks really can help, because it's a challenge that a lot of organizations have gone through, right? And we've seen that happen, and we've kind of like scratched our knees and seen companies scratch their knees. It will vary depending on where the organization is at. I think if you're already doing some form of infrastructure as code, if you're already familiar with declarative configuration, and if you already have a solution, your services, what you're deploying is already cloud native, it's going to be way easier than otherwise. But it will still bring benefit. You just have to kind of like find the proper spot where to wedge in, like where you can leverage and introduce GitOps, because after all, GitOps is all about abstracting complexity, right? Like, it's about reducing complexity. The fact that you're using declarative configuration eliminates the complexity of imperative configuration, where you have to provide instructions that change. You let that outside of the concern of what you're doing, and that's just handled by agents. You're removing complexity. So wherever you can integrate that to remove complexity, you're helping yourself.
Great, Leo. So I wanted to dig in a bit about what you were just talking about, which is Kubernetes, and how important it is for the hyperscalers like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. So each of them offer their own version of managed Kubernetes, and AKS, EKS, those are the ones that most of the organizations actually use today. So I wanted to ask what you see when you look at the cloud vendors and their approach to GitOps, because obviously you work very closely with them. So, you're the best person to really comment on this. Looking from the outside, I've seen that, AWS and Azure particularly are very pro GitOps. They have integrations for GitOps products with their EKS and AKS services. They put out blog posts and tutorials regularly on GitOps. And they've even funded companies like Weworks in the GitOps space. So it's great to see all of that happening. So I wanted to ask what you see when you look at the hyperscalers and their approach to GitOps, and for organizations that run their systems on these hyperscalers, what's a typical GitOps pipeline like? If you could talk to that a bit.
Right. Okay. So, and this is, I think this is applicable to anywhere. Let's talk about in kind of generics first, right? You need a place to store your configuration. That if you kind of like are very much following kind of like the GitOps foundational path, right? You need a Git repo. So in what's it called? In AWS, you have what's the word? What's the name of the code? What is it? No, not code deploy. So AWS has this managed Git service, which is called I forget the name. How did I forget the name? No, probably. Code something, because it's all code something. In AWS, it's code something. So you use the code proper name for storing your Git configuration, right? Then you're going to need some. Now, GitOps is a component of CI/CD. And one of the things that I think is very valuable about GitOps is that it creates this clear boundary between continuous integration and continuous deployment or continuous delivery, right? Because each stage has a different objective. Continuous integration is all about producing an artifact that is reliable, that you can trust, that is performing, right? Continuous deployment is safely delivering and exposing that artifact or that new release to your users, right? So there's this boundary. And matter of fact, you usually operate both stages kind of like in different places. You have this integration environment where you're pulling packages from the outside world and you're running tests and tests and you're building artifacts and signing artifacts. And then you have multiple runtimes, like different stages that is going to run that release at some point in time and validate that it can be promoted to the next stage. So in any case, because you are creating this boundary between CI and CD, and continuous integration is all about building a trustable artifact, a proven artifact, you need some form of workflow mechanism, right? Something that allows you to declare a sequence of actions, a sequence of steps that will be necessary to produce a release. The continuous integration aspect of it, what's running your tests and running your build and et cetera, right? So you need some form of workflow. For that, AWS has its code pipeline service, right? You're gonna need some place to store your artifacts. So if you think about the CI component, right? You have your repository where you have your code and your configuration. You push that through a pipeline that runs your tests and runs your build and signs your artifact. Now you have to push that somewhere, right? That's where ECR, in the case of AWS, comes in, the Elastic Container Registry, right? So you push your artifact, which is signed, and it's validated that it's got an SBOM, et cetera, right? And this is kind of like the CI side of your CI/CD. Got it. But once you have that release, that's where GitOps comes into play, right? Now you have multiple environments that are ready and able to pull that new release, validate that the release is trustworthy, that it's secure, that it was built given the pipeline that you actually expected to have been used to build it, and run it in an environment, and maybe follow some specific deployment pattern, right? Maybe you want to do canary release, right? And just deploy a little bit of it and see and test it and see how it behaves. So this is the continuous deployment side of things. And this is where GitOps tooling comes into place, such as Weave GitOps or our open source project Flux and Flagger to do progressive delivery, and where policy engines come into play, such as the Weave GitOps policy engine that is validating that what you're actually running in a given runtime is what you expect to be running on that runtime, right? So this is kind of like all the different tools, general place to put your code, place to store your artifacts, a workflow mechanism to basically get the code and build an artifact from it, CI side, and then GitOps tool on the other end to handle the continuous reconciliation, quote unquote, deployment of it.
Wow, what I really find interesting about what you said, Leo, is that typically I would think that, GitOps starts with Git. And yeah, while the process does start there, what I noticed about you just now is that you emphasize that GitOps is about the second half of the pipeline, the software delivery pipeline, or it's about the last mile. It's about deployments, automating that part of the pipeline. And I think that's what's really new with GitOps from what you're saying. And I find that fascinating because it's all about making sure that releases are automated, but they're secure and that there are policies governing them. And I think that's really an interesting thing about what you just said.
And I think that's something that is slowly changing as well. I think as the operating model becomes more mature and as more tools are built to follow the GitOps principles, you'll see kind of like, and this concept of also kind of shift left of GitOps as well, right? You can see that kind of in open source, where more and more tools, like think about, for example, the tectons of the world, right? Which is kind of like this workflow type of mechanism, but where you are actually running it within the containerized environment. You're actually running it as containers, and it's declarative as well for the most part. As more and more tools embrace this operating model, I think you'll see it shift left over time, and further abstract components of the CI/CD process as it matures.
All right, I'd like to backtrack a bit about what you spoke earlier about, that greenfield applications. It's easier for them to adopt GitOps, but then in the real world, most applications aren't greenfield, and organizations for various reasons need to run their systems on premises. And when you think of GitOps, you normally think cloud native, you think modern, but the cloud vendors themselves, they've got a lot of large customers with big on-premise installations. So, how is GitOps solving for that really large segment of the market, the on-premise segment? If you could talk a bit about that.
Certainly, and just to be clear, I think it's difficult. So legacy is challenging to turn into cloud native. I think that's the overarching challenge, where GitOps is a component of, right? If you have a legacy application that maybe is not built for horizontal scalability, that maybe requires all sorts of local storage, and you need to quote unquote translate that into a cloud native containerized application that follows the 12 factors, you're going to have to do some architectural changes for the most part, right? But I think that is the kind of like this, besides the point of GitOps as an operating model, regardless of where you are. And this is very much aligned to Kubernetes and how Kubernetes is becoming the control plane for all sorts of other projects that allow you to declaratively manage and operate external resources using Kubernetes as a control plane. So, for example, and we're starting to see that, think about EKS Anywhere, for example, right? Where you are now deploying a distribution of Kubernetes, EKS distro, on top of bare metal, and this is something that was recently released, by using Cluster API Cluster API is this project that has all sorts of different providers that allow you to declaratively provision or deploy Kubernetes on top of other infrastructure, including bare metal machines. We have in Weworks this really cool project called Liquid Metal that also allows you to deploy EKS distro on top of micro VMs on top of bare metal, right? And you do all that declaratively using Cluster API and Kubernetes and a GitOps tool to handle the quote unquote deployment of it. Okay. There's other projects out there, for example, Crossplane. Crossplane allows you, also using a provider type of mechanism, to provision cloud resources in multiple clouds. So this is now something that allows you to, like provision your DynamoDB or provision your RDS instance, right? There's projects out there that are handling database migrations declaratively, right, as Kubernetes custom resources. This is kind of like the landscape. And Alexis, Weworks' CEO, thinks about this kind of like in the context of GitOps 2.0, right, where GitOps as an operating model with its declarative configuration, its agent-based mechanism for abstracting complexity, extends itself beyond Kubernetes, beyond cloud native, to manage your bare metal machines, to handle the provisioning and the configuration of those bare metal machines, to handle everything on top of a consistent work plan and a consistent workflow. EKS Anywhere, as I mentioned, is showing that path. There's other clouds out there, Azure Arc, both EKS Anywhere and Azure Arc Kubernetes. They both have Flux built into them, and it's using Flux to manage configuration already in hybrid environments. So this is kind of like already showing that path, and the hyperscalers are taking the lead in using GitOps as a mechanism to handle kind of like this world where there isn't this kind of like green field anywhere, right? That there is this brown field of constant change, and what's cloud native today is also going to change, right? So there's a lot of work that is being done both in the community as well as kind of like in the closed enterprise to get us there.
And so I wanted to actually ask a bit more about the kind of attitude that the hyperscalers have towards GitOps, because integrating something like a Flux into EKS Anywhere or Azure Arc is quite a big deal. And I wanted to ask if these kind of initiatives are coming more top-down from the hyperscalers themselves who see this as important, or is it more bottom-up where there's the open source community and the GitOps startups that are actually really pushing these sort of things, and the hyperscalers are reacting to all of that momentum. What do you think?
I think hyperscalers are very much taking a kind of like a leading role, okay. And I think there's few industries out there that get GitOps as good as hyperscalers, because they have to manage gigantic infrastructure, right? So that gives them a unique perspective as to, this makes sense. Like this is very powerful. Also, I think it signals an increasing level of trust into what the community is building. I think it's also solidifying this synergy between community and enterprise, right? I really hope to see kind of like more flow in the direction of towards community, for sure, right? I think we've seen how the AWSs and the clouds of the world are really leveraging the fantastic technology that is being built by open source. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for them to feed a lot of kind of like value back into the community. But what it is certain is that they're saying, you know what, we trust what you folks are doing. We trust what the community is doing, so much so that we're bundling it together with our with our services. And the CNCF, I think, is doing a great work in materializing that, right? In having this due diligence process and solid framework where they're saying, you know what, this open source solution is capable of servicing enterprise grade customers, right? So yeah, I think it's a great synergy, and definitely the cloud vendors are jumping into the GitOps wagon like incredibly. The fact that they're bundling this type of solution into their hybrid Kubernetes offerings is just mind blowing.
Wow, those are a lot of reasons to be excited about GitOps right now. So we're almost out of time. We're winding down. And lastly, I wanted to just ask you about Weworks and what Weworks has to offer. So obviously there's the open source tools, Flux, Flagger, Helm, and all of these different open source tools that you can sort of stitch together and make a basic GitOps pipeline. But I just want to get your thoughts on, what does Weave offer beyond these do-it-yourself open source solutions?
Well, we have our product, which is called Weave GitOps, and Weave GitOps uses this underlying engine, our open source tools that we donated to the CNCF. But there's one thing that we've identified, and you used the word stitch, right? There's like all organizations are having to kind of find their own ways to stitch the things together, and there's challenges in terms of visibility. How is my deployment operating in terms of configuration, in terms of compliance, right? Weave GitOps, which is our product, basically uses this very mature, very secure open source projects as at its core, but builds on top of it continuous compliance with our policy engine and policy as code. It builds kind of like this mechanism to deliver packaged solutions to teams for self-service. It brings in UI that is kind of like one of the key gaps that we see from development teams when they're running workloads in Kubernetes, kind of like understanding what is it that I'm running, right? Where is it running at, and what's the status of it? So Weave GitOps, I really encourage everybody to take a look. If you want to adopt GitOps, maybe you're already running Flux, maybe you're new to GitOps, but kind of like our product will definitely make the barrier of entry way lower and accelerate your adoption of GitOps.
Really interesting. It sounds like Weave is this bridge between your production clusters and your AWS stacks that, code starts from AWS, Weave takes over from there, automatically deploys it into your production clusters.
And you can use it across environments. It allows you to do multi-stage deployment. You can see multiple clusters from one single location. Think about it kind of like an extension. The cloud already brought you that, right? It brought you abstractions. It brought you an API and a graphical user interface where you can click a button and do stuff. We went from that to infrastructure as code, where now you deploy, like, think about the past, like just a CloudFormation template or Terraform using a CLI and saw stuff happen. Now you have Weave GitOps that uses declarative configuration in your Git repo, and you can manage all your clusters, and you can implement policy engines, and you can offer a platform to your development teams. So it's further abstraction on top of the cloud to enable your developers to build software faster, to deliver it natively to Kubernetes faster, without as much understanding of the kind of like primitives of what Kubernetes is all about. And give you kind of consistent platform for both your operators and your developers to build and deliver containerized solutions.
Yeah, so I see, the key word that I take from there is platform. And I think that's a topic for a whole other interview itself. But I wanted to end this one just saying thanks, Leo, for just sharing all of those really interesting and really insightful ideas with us today. It was great having you. But before we finish, though, I've got a couple of fun questions to get to know you a little bit more. So hope you're ready for those. All right, so the first question, which brings up a lot of interesting answers, is your alternate career path if not for your job in tech.
All right. So let me do an anecdote for that. I've actually I started working in tech when I was 12 years old. I found it a BBS. That for anybody that doesn't know, BBS is this is pre-internet stuff. Like people would dial into the system. So I actually never really had a different career path because I actually didn't even realize it was a career until I became a grown-up, right? But the anecdote that I want to share with you is when I was in my 20s, I used to race motorcycles, super bikes. And I had a girlfriend back then. And one day I'm like, you know what? This is it. I want to become a professional race driver, a professional motorcycle race driver. And she was like, no, you're not going to do that. You're too old for that. And I was outraged. I was like, how could you possibly burst my bubble? I'm going to turn into a professional motorcycle racer. And here I am. So if she's listening to this, she was right. I did not turn into a professional racer.
Okay, so I'm a biker myself, so I have to ask, which is your favorite bike?
Oh, my favorite, all like hands down favorite bike, my R1. I loved my R1, my Yamaha R1.
Do you still have one?
No, yes, I have one, but not a sport bike anymore. So when my first, so I have 3 kids. When my first child was born, I had multiple. I had an R1, I had a GSXF 650, I had a bunch of different bikes because I love them, all sport bikes. When my first kid was born, I all of a sudden became afraid of dying. So I at that time I sold my bikes and I stopped. This was when I was 31. I sold my bikes and I'm like, all right, I gotta settle down. But now I have 3 kids and I have bikes again. So, but I changed kind of like my style. Now I ride a V-Strom 650, just kind of like to take the wife out. But I really have the itch to get me a sport bike again. So before 2022 is over, I'm probably gonna get me a Ducati. I want to get me a 900cc super bike just for kicks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a Kawasaki 650.
Yeah, Kawasaki, what, a ZX?
Yeah, the Z650.
Oh, nice. Yeah, those are good bikes.
Okay, the next question. One thing that you've tried and failed miserably at. Could be a sport, could be a hobby, could be a programming language, anything.
At cooking, I always had this fantasy of being a cook. Not being a cook, but like I meal prep because I lift weights and stuff. And I always said, you know what, I'm going to cook my own meals. And I suck at it. My food's terrible. And I tried once and again, I bought books. I did all sorts of things. Not a good cook. Not going to be a good cook.
Yeah, well, thank God for the food delivery app.
Exactly.
Your next question. If you could have lunch with one person living or dead, who would it be?
Talk to Buddha, for sure.
Way back.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Well, where do you find the most engaging conversations happening today around technology?
Oh, the community, open source. That's part of it. You know, like if you really want to get to know people and have kind of all these great conversations, community, and it's no longer a place in the world. It's kind of like a you know, like, because at some point in time you could say, you know, like, oh, Silicon Valley, right? But not anymore. I think it's happening all over the place, and the community, you know, the open source community is the place. It's distributed. It's agnostic. I think it's great. But
how do you actually engage with the community?
Well, I think first of all, there's all sorts of meetups happening all over the place. There's all sorts of kind of like get-togethers happening, and they became virtual because of the pandemic. You're starting to see them happen for real, kind of like in real life, a little bit again. There's conferences, KubeCon, you know, there's summits happening all over the place, and out of that, you find projects, you know, that go to GitHub and find projects, and there's conversations happening right there. There's Slack channels and workspaces where you can join. So there's all over the place stuff that you can find. I'd say if you want to kind of like step number 1, look for local meetups, meet some local people, and they'll take you places.
Well, thanks so much, Leo. It was wonderful talking to you today. How do our viewers find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I guess we can share the link because it's a strange name to type. So we'll share the link and find me on LinkedIn. And I'm in the community. So if you join the CNCF Slack, you'll find me there. If you kind of look around, I'm all over the place.
All right. So that was it, everyone. That's our interview with Leo today. Thank you for tuning in again. And I want to remind you that if you like what you just heard, then you'll definitely want to hear more like this. So head over to amazic.com and check out our YouTube channel, and do keep track of all that we do, because we're really, doing some really interesting stuff, talking to really interesting people in the space, and you'll definitely want to stay up to date on what's up here. So with that, we're signing off. Leo and myself, Twain, thanks again for joining us. See you next time.
Thank you, Twain. Thanks, everybody. Bye.